Yeah. Good morning. What, is it morning? Yeah, it is still morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Rail Live 2025. It is a delight to have you in the engineering theatre. Before I yak on, I must say a very strong thanks to Pandrel for sponsoring the engineering theatre this year, as they did last year. They allow us to have nice, chewy conversations that are perhaps a little bit more in depth than you might see at over at the Policy Theatre. But it is an absolute delight. We're talking about freight, by the way. This is the freight session. It is an absolute delight to have the Chief Exec of Freightliner Group for Europe, Tim Shoveler, joining to have a chat about, well, we have absolutely no plan. We're just going to talk about freight. We're going to talk about the pressures, the kind of some of the big opportunities, because I think, well, I'll tell you what, so off the back of COVID, we've seen through COVID, freight was very visibly a serious enabler of the country continuing to not be on its knees. And that was a good news story. And in some ways, from a policy perspective, we have ridden the back of that wave a bit to make sure there is more emphasis on targets set for, we had the growth target that was perhaps, well, we can talk about that in a minute, but so there's this positivity. Do you from the actual supply chain side, are you seeing the material effect of that? Do you think it is there positivity, or has there been a little bit of puff and maybe not quite the momentum in seeing the efforts from government to push things? What do you think?
So, look, I mean, there's no doubt that rail freight did come to the public's, visibility.
Wait a sec. We've got a shaking head from we might have to percussive maintenance on the. I think there's some weaving going on. There's some batteries coming. Wait a minute. Here we go. Thanks, Stefan. I've done so well in not having any tech. I was half expecting that I'd sit on my thing and destroy it from the heat earlier, but we've got away without it so far. So I'm lucky it's not my fault that the tech's broken this time. Thanks, Stefan. Here we are. Yeah, you're just going to press a button and then we'll be. Yeah, testing, etc. That's it. Sorry, Tim. Yeah.
Is that any better?
How's that? That's gone.
Go on, I'll keep talking. Porridge for breakfast.
Shall we just have a hand mic? Yeah, let's just give you a hand mic.
Right, is that better?
Yeah.
Right, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Well, thanks for coming along. Yes, so I'm super passionate about freight, rail and all things like that. So very happy to sort of just shoot the breeze a bit. Yes, there's no doubt that COVID really helped in bringing freight to the visibility, because I think Scotland was going to run out of toilet rolls. And there was nothing like a crisis around toilet rolls to bring to bring freight to the forefront of people's minds. But what it particularly did from a Network Rail perspective, and I was obviously running a chunk of Network Rail at the time, was illustrate that actually if some freight trains don't run, really bad things happen really quickly. Yeah. Whether that be the lights going out because Drax provides, a huge percentage of the country's electricity, whether it be toilet rolls to Scotland, and all of the other elements of the supply chain. Suddenly rail and rail freight became very visible. There's no doubt that I think there's always been a sort of quite a positive view of rail freight, actually. And great people like Maggie Simpson and the Rail Freight Group over many years have done fantastic work to illustrate the benefits of rail freight. And we've all got really important statistics. Okay, you have to remember this as a test. Moving something by rail freight, a ton of moved by rail freight uses 76% less carbon than if it goes by lorry. And that's a diesel engine. If it moves by an electric locomotive, and we've got 25 electric locomotives, it's 95% less energy than if it goes less CO2 than if it goes by lorry. Just remember those two. If you remember nothing else, if you can remember those two statistics and drop them in at every opportunity you get, that says why rail freight's a good idea, because it's sustainable. It uses low electricity, and it would, wouldn't it? Because that's what railways do. One of the big USP of railways is that it's a very low energy form of transport compared to any other base of land, sea or air based of transport. That's a fantastic advantage for us to have.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there is for anyone with vision, you can look ahead at some of the, let's say, it's not threats, the opportunities of low emission zones, meaning that you have to move away from first to last mile completely served by a lorry. That is not a world we're going to be living in. But we also have the world where there is no viable EV replacement for the current operating model of HGVs, where the driver and the fuel load can take the goods from full journey to full journey. As soon as you have a charging stop for your whatever, and even those don't really fully exist yet, but say you get a BEV, HGV that works, you will have to have a charging stop, which means that that's equivalent of a moment of transshipment, and suddenly as rail, we can be like, hello, if you're having to stop, you might as well do a transshipment and get it on a train for the majority of its journey, because all of a sudden, all of the benefits that you've just highlighted flip the economic equation as well for the logistics industry. So there is and in a way, that's a threat, because are we ready for it?
Well, that's a threat that I'm not worried about, because what you've just described is what I would describe as the best case scenario. There is, and look, very big global companies have actually decided what the premise that you've just set out, which I like, and emotionally I would support, but very big global companies have said, no, that's not how it's going to be. They're not banking on a world where you have to use rail. They are banking and betting on a world where you can continue to use trucks.
Which is funny, because the tech ain't going to deliver that, much as they would love it to.
Again, I want you to be right, okay, but I've got to look at this objectively, and it's not quite as clear cut. There's no doubt, and I'm not making the case for road, or I'm making the case for battery vehicles.
Well, for us to step up is essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, but essentially, we cannot rely on an increase in cost, because that's what it would be, which means every single one of you are going to pay. An electric lorry costs about 3 times the price of a diesel lorry, and it does about a third of the work. So if that continues to be true, that would put a huge inflation cost into everything that we buy, right? Now, actually, maybe that's right. Maybe if that's the damage it does to the environment, okay. But you can see why there's a whole industry, especially all the people that make lorries and buses and what have you, that don't want that to be true. So I don't know. I think we've got to be cautious about that, and I can't bank on the fact that this 100%. Is all going to come our way.
We cannot be complacent.
I'd love it to be the case. But even at the moment, when we're having conversations with all of our big, whether they're shipping lines, whether they're quarries and major construction companies, at the moment, none of them are really prepared to pay even an extra few pence to make the change between normal diesel and green diesel. Yeah. When we say, look, we've got 25 electric locos, if we use an electric loco on your train, that will give you a lower carbon emission. They're not willing to pay for it. Now, I hope that Generation X and Y, and some of you in the audience, actually will make that intolerable, because you won't buy stuff from companies that don't move things in an environmentally friendly way. But it's not arrived yet, but I hope it does.
Yeah, so let's talk about the target that was set, because it was a target set by the previous government. I'm curious to know whether that energy is still there politically to ensure that we're delivering that target. Admittedly, I have some problem with the target because it was set against relative numbers rather than absolute overall picture. But still, remind everyone what that target was and where we're at with it today.
Okay, so last government, about a year before the election, set a target that there should be an increase in the volume of train movements, rail freight, of 75% by 2050. It's the first time there's ever been a rail freight target from government, so welcome that. Yeah. And I'm told it really plays an important part, because once government has an official target, then the civil servants in all of the departments have to pay cognizance to that. They have to take account of that government target. So that's great. 75% itself is a bit of a disappointment. I think we're all hoping for 100 or more. 75% is a CAGR, compound annual growth rate of 2%. So when I was working in the passenger companies, if I said I'm going to grow the business at 2% a year, I'd have got fired.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a very low growth target. But it is the first time there has been one. Now, and it has generated some policy benefits, so fair credit. It would have been 100% but for the HS2 decision, I'm told.
Yeah.
Okay? To cancel the northern part of HS2. That's why it was reined back. The current government have stuck with that target for the moment, but are reviewing it in light of the move towards GBR. We think it's really important that that target is maintained. There's some thought about breaking the target up into regional targets or maybe sector-specific. Here's a target for intermodal, here's a target for steel, for example. Fine, but the aggregate, 75%,
has to be as, if not more ambitious.
Absolute minimum, has got to stay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things, in fact, it's one of my slides in the test track tent over there. It says, Jürgen Meyer emphasized this in the pre-election UTG report, saying that to reach the government's own net zero targets, they need to be doubling both passenger and freight capacity on the railway by, well, Jürgen said 2035, fair play, even more ambitious than I've been saying, but it needs to be by at least 2040. So that's 100%, and also that's 100% in absolute terms. That's not just relative, that's absolute to modal share. So that's doubling our modal share for rail freight. Yes. But 75% is still a target, which is great. I'm glad that target exists.
It's been useful. Where Jürgen has identified that, I would agree. And I think it's really possible. So currently about 6% of freight moved in the UK goes by rail. In Germany, it's 14%.
Yeah.
And Germany's got inland waterways. So actually the competition in Germany should be greater than it is in the UK. In fact, more moves by ship around the UK from place to place than it does by rail freight. So there is.
I heard that statistic recently. I did a head explosion when I read that.
I mean, now, of course, look, if you're counting tons and you're moving stone from Scotland to Kent, you can shift an awful lot of tons, can't you? But nevertheless, rail freight, I think, can easily double what it's doing, and that's based on the things that rail freight currently moves. Moves very well, intermodal boxes. Stones, aggregates, cements, and what have you. Let alone what else rail freight could do and does do in Europe, but doesn't do here. Yeah.
So we've been very happy and excited at this point, but let's bring ourselves back to reality a little bit. I'm going to pick on the East Coast because I know it very well. East Coast finally getting a timetable update in 2025. Fingers crossed. But it's because of the demise of HS2 in its entirety, and this is the East Coast timetable shows how critical the eastern leg of HS2 was, and we still need that, by the way, everyone. The timetable cuts freight paths drastically. The number of freight paths actually being used different, but in terms of the available freight paths, what does that look like, not just to Freightliner, but to your colleagues as well in the rest of the sector?
So the East Coast, hopefully, will be the low point of the rail for the last 15, 20 years, won't it? Because it's been an embarrassment of new trains ordered against a new timetable, which was part of the Virgin Trains franchise, but an infrastructure that didn't match it, and competing franchises led by the same government that didn't fit. The classic was the Thameslink franchise and VTEC franchise were both required to run more trains over the two-track section, Welling Viaduct, than physically can be done, and they were let in that way. So East Coast has been a dreadful embarrassment for the industry. It's good, but there's so much good about it now, and full credit to David and his team at LNER.
It's a work of art. It's bonkers, and we shouldn't run away with that. But it is a work of art.
But they've done a smashing job with it. Full credit. And look, the new timetable will provide more capacity, and that's needed. Good. For passengers, less capacity for freight, and what that does is highlight what could become a really toxic challenge of you can have passengers or freight but not both. Well, if we're going to meet the climate challenge, we have to have both.
Has to be both. So
we've got to think differently, and actually the good news is there's some quite simple answers there. To give you an example, it's a West Coast example, but when we run an intermodal train of maybe about 2,000 tonnes from, say, Crewe to Scotland, it goes over the steepest hills of the West Coast route main line at 24 miles an hour if it's got a diesel engine on the front. So there's only one line in each direction, and at 24 miles an hour, the diesel loco hauls itself and its 2,000-tonne load over the steepest part of the hill. You imagine how long it takes then to do a section from Preston to Carlisle, and then it's the same at BTEC on the way to Scotland. When we use our electric locos, they go over the same route with the same weight train at 75 miles an hour. And if we were allowed to, we could do it at 80 or 90. So the benefit of electric traction for freight, which all of my companies in Europe use, much more extensive than the UK, is that you can accelerate your train much faster. It's much more compatible with passenger schedules, so that the freight train isn't the slow one. Electric trains are about 4 or 5 times more reliable than diesel trains, obviously much better for the environment, and can attain a top speed that's greater than diesel. So there is such a strong argument for electric freight.
I was going to pick this up. So worth highlighting that a 75-mile-an-hour intermodal 2,000-ton train beautifully timetables with a 110 or a 125 stopping train. They beautifully overlap each other. So on our horrible mixed traffic railway that's, again, a beautiful work of art, but not how you really get the best out of a railway, you have really good compatibility of an electric freight railway with an electric stopping railway, which is, again, why discontinuous electrification might have its applications, but we forget freight if we get too excited about that as a process. The reason a railway is incomplete until it has wires above it is because you can get the absolute optimum of a mixed traffic railway. I suppose I wanted to dig into that a little bit so I think it was the CILT a good while back, and it's been talked about again recently with the spending review, talked about what's probably like £1.5 billion worth of infill schemes that would give, I mean, specifically yourselves at Freightliner, a massive uplift in what you can successfully run end-to-end. Yep. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that looks like? Maybe for people who aren't familiar with that, talk a little bit about it and what you think of that and how it plays into your planning a little bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, this all comes down to policy choices, doesn't it? 36% of the UK network broadly is electrified. It's above 80 in mainland Europe. It would be lovely to electrify a lot more railways. I was talking to the guys at SPL. I really hope that we can do some more electrification. But we all know the country's really, not doing so much for cash at the moment. So I think what needs to happen is that Treasury needs to engage with private sector to fund that electrification. Because government clearly can't afford it and has chosen not to fund it in the
They've chosen not to.
They've chosen not to. And I'm not, better to spend it at hospitals, of course. But that's why British Rail got itself into the mess that it got into, because it was always better to fund hospitals and schools than British Rail. So we privatised the railways, okay? Well, now we go back to a nationalised railway, fine. I'm politically agnostic, but we've got to have access to the capital that the railway needs to be successful.
Yeah, all the capital we've had over the last 30 years with the privatised railway from the state. Right. It'd be nice if we had that with a nationalised railway.
Okay, so we've got to find ways of getting access to capital, and private sector is one of the ways of doing that. There are plenty of ways of doing that. My shareholders are a Canadian company. It's got $1 trillion of assets under management. They'd love to invest in electrification in the UK. We're investing in electrification in other countries around the world, but not in the UK yet. So there's an opportunity for Treasury to become more friendly to supporting private sector investment in the UK rail network. That would allow things like that to happen. Not all of it requires billions of pounds. We run about 30 trains a day to and from London Gateway Port. It's only 3 miles from the terminal at London Gateway to Tilbury. And then from Tilbury onwards, every destination we go to is electrified. Glasgow, Manchester, Birmingham. We've got the electric locomotives. But because of the fact it's so expensive at the moment, so we have to diesel haul because of that 3 miles. To take a diesel locomotive off and swap it over for an electric locomotive, which we can do, but of course what that does is add about an hour's delay into every train.
You also need the space to do it. You have to have a siding somewhere, you have to so on and so on and so on.
And now I've got 2 locomotives. I've got the electric one going on, and I've got a diesel one coming off. I've got 2 drivers, I've got a shunter, I've got space, I've got time. So actually what you do is you make the railway inefficient. So the answer is either make a decision and electrify the bits that need to be electrified, and for about 60 million quid, actually you could do enough infill schemes to make a big difference to rail freight. So very small amounts of money. Yep. London Gateway itself would probably cost about 15 million. It's small change. We could run 30 trains a day by electric that are currently running on diesel. Or decide as a country we're not going to do any more electrification, and I wouldn't support that, but you could decide that and decide you want to buy lots of bi-mode trains. But for goodness sake, do one or the other.
Make a decision, absolutely.
And this is one of the areas where I expect that GBR will be able to add value to the industry, because at the moment we've had no serious leadership in those sort of policy decisions, because no one individual has been able to make them other than DFT, and they haven't. So now, perhaps with GBR coming on board over the next few years, we should start to see a strategy and a plan. And I'd really welcome that, whatever it concludes, actually, because any plan's better than no plan.
Just the certainty to actually deliver something. I want to change and talk about something different, actually, which is new entrants from an end user, a customer, our customers, the logistics, whether it's logistics or whether it's, supermarkets or whoever it happens to be. How easy a job do you think new entrants are finding it to get freight on the railway? Is that something that you think we've got better at? Is it something that we're still bad at? What are your views on that? Because as we want more growth, it means we need to be super accessible and open. And for example, Lidl need to be able to know who to speak to get some stuff. How does that work?
Yeah, no, and actually it works very well. And the last 2 days, there's just been the multimodal exhibition in the NEC in Birmingham, biggest event of the year. Every single big logistics company was there,
fab.
right?
Okay, yeah.
And GBR transition team have done a great job about making sure that there are some simple places you can go to find out who to talk to. Actually, when I talk to potential customers who currently don't use rail, it's a very similar conversation than I used to have with passengers who don't use rail. Customers that don't use rail, passengers or freight, tend to think it's very expensive, very unreliable. I can't possibly take the risk. I'll just drive or go by lorry. Right? They have so the perceptions are exactly the same. Once you then put existing customers in front of them and say, for example, we do a lot of work for P&O, or no, so we started a new train with P&O ferries from Tilbury to Manchester. So we use people like John, the guy that runs P&O, or Andrew Malcolm, who runs Andrew Malcolm. They're a big Scottish haulier. They're a road company. We use them to talk to, not use, sorry, that's the wrong expression. We ask them, we invite them to share with potential customers to say, no, I'm a road company. Malcolm's is a very well-established Scottish road company. We use rail, and it works for us, and this is why it works for us. And their voice, obviously, is more compelling than mine.
Yeah, that's like, it's funny, yesterday, storytelling and the fact the industry is not a good enough storyteller came up again and again, partly because I always make it. And one of the things I was saying is, we spend a lot of time maybe going to government, please, sir, please, sir, please, sir. What actually we could and should be doing as an industry is going out to the public and saying, look, public, this is why railways are fantastic. This is why you should, by the way, shout at the politicians on our behalf. And in a way, that's what you're saying with customers, is the best advocate isn't us. We know everyone here loves railways. We know that. And we know why it's good. But the best advocates are the end users, the customers, who can then get more in.
So let's face it, the big reason why most voters would like to see more rail freight is because there's less lorries on the road. Yeah. Here's another amazing stat for you. This is a true stat, okay? And it was given me by a previous rail minister. Because everyone sees potholes in most parts of the country have got huge potholes. And of course, it's no surprise about 10 years ago we increased the maximum weight of lorries to 44 tonnes. It does a lot of damage to the roads, which is one of the reasons why the roads are in such a state of disrepair. One HGV lorry at 44 tonnes does as much damage to the road as 136,000 Ford Focuses.
Fourth power law. That's what
136,000 Ford Focuses, or one HGV at 44 tonnes. Okay, so that's why the roads are falling apart, guys. And no matter how quickly you patch them, they're going to continue to fall apart. So either you've got to increase the amount of money you spend on roads, or have fewer heavy lorries. Talking about that, of course, then creates a bit of pressure on companies to say, well, look, I've got 250 lorries in my fleet to distribute containers from the rail freight terminal to the warehouse. They're doing runs of maybe 10 miles. That does work with battery EVs,
exactly.
by the way.
That's another thing that starts working as a model.
So you can do that, but what you don't want to do is run an HGV from Felixstowe to Manchester, because that's crazy. That's busy roads, that's damaging the roads, bad for the environment. The reason people do it is because it's cheaper than rail. Yep. Unfortunately, and this is the thing, economics trumps everything. And that it is cheaper currently to move a container from Manchester to Felixstowe or vice versa by road than it is by train. And despite all those disadvantages, but of course the lorry is not paying its full cost of the damage it does to the road, whereas the train does pay the cost of the wear and tear on the railway. So we've got this very inequitable system, and so we can have fantastic conversations with customers, and we do. And a lot of them would love to move more by rail, but they're not going to all the time that it's more expensive. Yeah. It'd be crazy to think otherwise.
And it sounds like, so I'm going to go to questions, by the way, so line up your questions if you have them. Shove your hand up in just a second. It sounds like, to kind of round that off before we go to questions, actually, that storytelling piece is really important. We've got, as you say, you obviously have to be more of a not pessimist, but more pragmatic. Say, well, I'm more of an idealist. I'm saying there is an enormous opportunity. We cannot be complacent, but there is an enormous opportunity in the HGV driver shortage, the fact that roads have literally physically, not even just in traffic, but like physically reached their capacity for tonnage. The railways are far from it. All these, EVs, all these things that are like lining us up, like, oh, suddenly there'll be a dramatic British-style tipping point where we really can't do it the old way anymore. We have to be ready as an industry. That's exciting, right? And we have to tell that story. So, questions. Who has questions? Okay, so let's, question there, and then David in front.
Hi, Nick Smith from Epion. I'm interested in the last mile. When the railway was spread out initially in the 19th century, it drove a huge increase in the number of horses needed in city centres. And I'm wondering how you envisage the last mile. Are we looking at do we have enough? Do we need more road-rail interchanges? What's going to be the impact?
Well, there's an entire session of itself. Good question, though. Tim.
Super question, thank you.
2 minutes if you can, no pressure.
Absolutely. So look, there's an awful lot that can be done. There's an awful lot of infrastructure there that's not being used currently. If you leave Euston, you go past the Princess Royal Distribution Centre that was built especially for parcels and mail traffic to be transshipped to and from road. It's not in use anymore. So, but it's still there, and there's many other locations like that around the country. There are new rail freight terminals being built all the time, and there's capacity in the ones that exist right now. So actually, I think in terms of getting stuff off the train and onto a vehicle to allow it to be distributed, that's not my worry. And I think the EVs, whether it's an EV truck or an EV van, actually allow that to be done in a sustainable way. So I think it really helps that solution.
Yeah.
And there is also some work going on to look at, could you do something from Euston or Waterloo, particularly 2 stations that have been examined, and I'm sure something could be done.
Yeah, nice one, David.
David Frankel, graduate at Network Rail. I'm not expressing a particular view on this, but I'm curious to hear what you think about what I could describe as the conceptual tension between GBR as a centralised directing mind and devolution to local areas, local mayors with their priorities vis-à-vis access to freight for instance, in places like central Manchester.
Yeah.
So to be fair to Andy Burnham, I don't think I think the quote that he said he didn't want freight running through the centre of Manchester. That's what he said, and he said it at an event where he was opening a new rail freight terminal. Now, to be fair to Andy, because I'm a wee bit frightened of him, he didn't. What he meant was, we do want freight in Manchester and we're not on rail, but don't run it through the centre of Manchester. And actually, I kind of agree with him on that. Actually, the Castlefield corridor, which is the key route through central Manchester, is not the best place for a freight train to be.
You wouldn't want to run a freight train through a crossrail, right? So it's...
Well, although we do. I mean, ironically, it's exactly what we do at both ends, and of course, the North London line. So you can have suburban freight and suburban and freight together, but you shouldn't plan it that way. Yeah. And most sensible countries don't. So it's right to try and move freight out of central Birmingham. So your point about GBR, because of the fact that we are where we are with the infrastructure we've got and the railway we've got, we have to make the optimum use of it. So electric freight rather than diesel. So if it is going to run through central Manchester, because it's electrified, it can get out of the way quicker, for example. But actually, yes, so if we can then look at strategic schemes that would move rail freight out of central Manchester to maybe somewhere like Newton-le-Willows, and I don't know, you could redevelop the existing Trafford Park freight terminal into, I don't know, a new stadium for Man United, because it's right next door. I imagine in 5 or 6 years' time, that's exactly what will happen.
Yeah. There's another question in front, and then I will wrap us up.
Yeah, Mark Sullivan. This question was asked yesterday, but I'll ask it to you. The electricity bill has gone up by double, from 379 million to 885 million in 2 years. And Freightliner is now not running electric freight, as I understand it, because the cost of the power is too high. Now, in France and Switzerland, all rail freight is operated by electric, and they have much cheaper electricity. But it appears to be UK policy to have high industrial electricity costs from Mr. Miliband, and that is having a very bad effect on rail freight, and I don't see the Transport Minister, speaking later, yet tackling that. But as the company that is actually virtually given up electric freight, where are we going on this, please, Mr. Shoveler?
Right, pleasant. So good news is, so Freightliner did withdraw all its its electric locomotives for a bit of time, but they're now all back in traffic, and we've just bought 2 more. So we are using electric freight, but no one else is. The other freight companies are not. The other rail freight companies aren't at the moment. Electricity is more expensive than diesel. It's also more volatile than diesel. And in Germany, where I run freight trains, what they've done very cleverly is say to the operators they'll cap the price of electricity at the same price as diesel. So whatever the diesel price is, the equivalent is what I pay to the German State Railway for electrification. And that means I can never be worse off. I'm not looking to profit out of it, but I can't lose anything either. So that is the type of approach I would like UK government to adopt to incentivise the use of electric freight, or discount it off the track access fee. You know, I pay a lot of money for track access. If it's an electric train, my argument is it should pay less track access because it's more reliable, it's better for the environment, accelerates quicker. And that's exactly the position we've had with government. But we are now running 22 locomotives of our 25 are in traffic every day. The other 3 are on maintenance, and we're very proud to do that.
It's a really neat moment to end, because I think it's really important that we remember the extent to which big policy questions, and indeed big policy questions outside of the rail domain, are broadly the biggest influencer on what we can do, particularly in freight world. And so looking to Europe, those big policy questions are extremely important for us as rail, and we as an industry need to be cognizant of that and chat to those other sectors to understand what we can do. Tim, what an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Everyone, please say thank you to Tim in the normal way. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for attending. See you for the next session. There's going to be a big chair clearing session now here for primary engineers, but I'll see you for the next session after that. Enjoy the rest of your day at Rail Live. Cheers, everyone.